There's a pattern that has destroyed every major empire in history, not conquest, not invasion, but economic collapse driven by the same chain of events. Every time, deficit, spending, currency, debasement, inflation, loss of confidence, and finally, collapse. Rome's empire, which ruled for 5 centuries, fell not because of foreign armies, but because its once pure silver coin, the denarius, was gradually diluted until it was 95% worthless metal. Spain, which once controlled more gold and silver than any nation in history, defaulted on its debts 4 times in 40 years in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596, as inflation devoured the value of its silver coins. Britain, whose pound sterling dominated global trade for 200 years, lost its empire within a single generation after its currency collapsed. After World War I, British national debt ballooned from $650 million in 1914 to over $7 billion by 1919. By 1945, after another World War, debt reached 270% of GDP, forcing repeated devaluations and the loss of reserve currency status. Every time the leaders of those empires believed they were different, that their power, technology, or influence would protect them from the laws of economics, they were wrong every single time. And now, in 2025, the United States is following the same pattern. Step by step, $36 trillion in federal debt, trillion-dollar annual deficits, endless money printing, and rising inflation. The only question left is whether America is at the beginning, the middle, or the end of the same historic cycle. Let's start with Rome, the empire that ruled Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East for more than 500 years. At its peak, it governed around 60 million people and stretched across 3 continents. The backbone of its economy was the denarius, a silver coin introduced in 211 BC containing about 4.5 grams of pure silver. For centuries, that purity never changed. Every coin represented real, tangible value trusted from Britain to Egypt. This unwavering trust in Roman money allowed the empire to pay its armies, fund massive construction projects, and expand its borders without losing stability. The denarius was more than currency. It was the foundation of Roman power, pure silver, real value. Emperor Nero, who ruled from AD 54 to 68, was the first Roman leader to significantly reduce the silver content of the denarius. Facing the enormous costs of military campaigns and his own extravagant lifestyle, Nero ordered the mints to cut the purity of Rome's currency from 100% silver to 90%. That 10% reduction allowed the empire to mint 11 coins from the silver that once made 10, a hidden tax that created inflation without public acknowledgement. Over the next century, this quiet debasement accelerated. By the reign of Emperor Caracalla around AD 211, the denarius contained only about 50% silver, half real value, half base metal. Soldiers and merchants still received coins stamped with the emperor's face, but the intrinsic value was collapsing. Under Emperor Gallienus by AD 265, the silver content had plunged to just 5%. What was once a solid silver coin had become a thinly plated token of trust, almost entirely worthless metal. The results were devastating. Inflation exploded, purchasing power evaporated, and wages became meaningless. A Roman soldier in 265 AD earned in denarii what once equaled only 1/12 of the pay 2 centuries earlier. The government insisted nothing had changed, but the economy told another story. The empire was literally melting its wealth away coin by coin as confidence in its currency and institutions began to erode. The government insisted nothing had changed. The coins still looked the same, still bore the emperor's image. But the reality was disastrous. Prices exploded. What once cost 1 denarius in AD 200 cost 50 by AD 300. Farmers stopped accepting coins altogether, demanding goods or gold instead. Soldiers refused to fight unless paid in real value. Tax collectors couldn't collect revenue because the currency was worthless. Trade collapsed, markets froze, and the empire's economy ground to a halt. This wasn't caused by invasion or disease. It was entirely self-inflicted, the inevitable consequence of destroying the value of Rome's own money. And when the currency died, the empire died with it. By AD 476, the Western Roman Empire had officially collapsed, not because of a foreign invasion or natural disaster, but because its economy could no longer function. The government couldn't pay its armies, tax revenues disappeared, and trade networks that once spanned 3 continents broke apart. Infrastructure decayed, cities emptied, and the legions that had protected Rome for centuries disbanded without pay. The fall of Rome was not sudden. It was the final stage of a long financial rot. Rome proved the pattern: destroy your currency, and your empire follows. In the 1500s, Spain entered what seemed to be its unstoppable golden age. Fresh from the voyages of Columbus and the conquests of the Aztecs and Incas, the Spanish Empire controlled the richest territories on Earth. In 1545, Spanish explorers discovered Cerro Rico in Potosí, located in present-day Bolivia, a mountain so full of silver that it was said to shine in the moonlight. For more than a century, Potosi alone produced nearly half of the world's silver supply, sending millions of pounds of bullion across the Atlantic each year. This incredible flow of metal made Spain the wealthiest nation on the planet. The Spanish dollar, or piece of 8, became the world's first truly global currency, trusted from Europe to Asia for its purity and consistency. But the very abundance of silver that made Spain rich also set the stage for its decline. When vast quantities of new money enter an economy without a matching rise in productivity, prices inevitably rise. Between 1,500 and 1,600, the price of goods in Europe increased roughly tenfold, one of the earliest examples of sustained inflation in world history. Silver coins still contained real metal, but because there was suddenly so much of it, each coin bought less and less. What looked like infinite wealth was actually a slow erosion of value. Instead of using this windfall to build industry or modernize its economy, Spain spent it. The crown financed endless wars, palaces, and luxury imports. Spanish nobles purchased fine goods from France, weapons from England, and ships from the Netherlands, exporting the empire's wealth right back to its rivals. The result was a paradox. Despite controlling the world's largest silver supply, Spain produced little of its own. Domestic manufacturing declined, dependence on foreign imports grew, and the empire's economy hollowed out. By the mid-1500s, Spain's finances were already in crisis. King Charles V had left his son, Philip II, an enormous debt of about 36 million ducats. Rather than reform, Philip borrowed even more to fund simultaneous wars against the Ottoman Empire Protestant rebels in the Netherlands and England. He assumed the silver fleets from the New World would cover the costs, but they never did. In 1557, Philip II declared bankruptcy, the first sovereign default in modern history. He stopped paying creditors, devastating Europe's banking centers. But the spending continued, and Spain defaulted again in 1560, again in 1575, and again in 1596, 4 defaults in just 40 years. Each one destroyed more of Spain's creditworthiness. Interest rates soared, and foreign lenders demanded harsher terms. The crown was forced to issue short-term debt backed by future taxes, mortgaging its empire's future just to survive in the present. Meanwhile, inflation worsened. Ordinary Spaniards watched prices skyrocket while their wages stagnated. The value of silver coins collapsed as faith in Spain's monetary system eroded. Soldiers went, unpaid revolts spread, and the government resorted to minting copper coins, pretending they were worth as much as silver, a fiction no one believed. By the early 1600s, the empire that once dominated global trade was drowning in debt and unable to fund its armies or maintain control over its colonies. The 1,648 Peace of Westphalia formally ended Spain's position as Europe's superpower. By 1700, the empire that had once ruled the world's wealth was a broken remnant of its former glory. Spain proved the pattern of flood of money, reckless government spending, chronic borrowing, repeated defaults, and the final loss of confidence. Even half the world's silver couldn't save a nation that spent more than it earned. The empire that once controlled global wealth had borrowed and inflated itself into irrelevance. Now we come to Britain, the empire that lasted longer, stretched farther, and controlled more wealth than Rome or Spain combined. At its peak in 1922, the British Empire ruled over 458 million people, nearly 1/4 of the world's population, and governed 1/4 of the Earth's landmass. The sun truly never set on the British Empire. Its power was not only political or military, but financial. For more than 2 centuries, the British pound sterling, backed by gold, was the foundation of global trade and finance. Over 60% of international transactions were conducted in pounds, and London was the undisputed financial capital of the world. But like every empire before it, Britain's dominance was built on a fragile foundation, one that debt and inflation would eventually destroy. When World War I broke out in 1914, Britain's national debt stood at approximately $650 million. By the time the war ended in 1919, that figure had skyrocketed to over $7 billion, a more than tenfold increase in just 5 years. To fund the war, Britain suspended the gold standard, printing vast amounts of paper money not backed by gold. The Bank of England flooded the economy with credit to sustain military spending. Inflation surged, and the real value of the pound began to erode. After the war, Britain sought to restore its former financial glory. In 1925, Chancellor of the Exchequer Winston Churchill made the controversial decision to return the pound to the gold standard at its pre-war exchange rate of $4.86 per pound. But this rate overvalued the currency by at least 10–15% relative to Britain's weakened economy. The consequences were disastrous. British exports became uncompetitive, unemployment soared above 1. 5 million in high interest rates crippled domestic growth. By 1931, faced with mounting economic pressure and a global depression, Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard, permanently devaluing the pound and ending more than a century of monetary dominance. The next great test came with World War II. Already heavily indebted from the previous war, Britain again turned to borrowing and money creation to fund its fight against Nazi Germany. By 1945, national debt had ballooned to around 270% of GDP, one of the highest ratios in history. London lay in ruins, industrial output had collapsed, and the empire's reserves were nearly exhausted. Britain had won the war militarily, but financially it was bankrupt. Even before the war ended, the seeds of Britain's decline were being planted. At the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the global financial system was redesigned. The U.S. dollar, not the pound, became the world's new reserve currency, pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. The pound, once as good as gold, was now subordinate. Britain entered the post-war era burdened with debt inflation and a shrinking empire. In 1947, Britain attempted to restore currency convertibility, allowing pounds to be freely exchanged for dollars and gold. The policy lasted only 6 weeks before a run on the pound forced the government to reimpose restrictions. In 1949, the pound was formally devalued by 30% from $4.03 to $2.80, a humiliating admission of financial weakness. Yet the cycle repeated. By 1967, under Prime Minister Harold Wilson, the pound was devalued again, this time by another 14% to $2.40. Meanwhile, Britain's empire was disintegrating. India gained independence in 1947. The Suez Crisis of 1956 exposed Britain's diminished power, and colony after colony declared independence throughout the 1960 seconds. By the 1970 seconds, Britain was no longer an empire, but a struggling post-industrial nation. Inflation soared to 25%, real wages stagnated, and labor strikes paralyzed the economy. In 1976, Britain was forced to request a bailout from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, a humiliating moment for the former banker of the world. Within just a few decades, the British Empire collapsed, not through invasion or revolution, but through currency debasement and debt. Britain proved the pattern once again: war spending, unsustainable borrowing, loss of gold, backing devaluation and inflation. The empire that had ruled the world's seas and financed its trade disintegrated under the weight of its own economic mismanagement. Britain fell not to an enemy army, but to the silent, relentless power of arithmetic, not through military defeat, but through currency collapse and debt. The United States, the current empire and the issuer of the world's reserve currency, is now following the same economic trajectory that doomed Rome, Spain, and Britain. Since 1944, under the Bretton Woods Agreement, the US dollar has served as the global reserve currency pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Other nations fixed their currencies to the dollar, making it as good as gold. But just like past empires, America began to spend far more than it earned. During the 1960 seconds, the costs of the Vietnam War and domestic programs under President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society drove government spending to unprecedented levels. By the end of the decade, foreign countries realized that the United States was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. In response, nations like France, led by Charles de Gaulle, began redeeming their dollar reserves for gold, as US. Gold reserves drained rapidly. President Richard Nixon made a fateful decision on the 15th of August 1971. He closed the gold window, ending the dollar's convertibility into gold. From that moment, the dollar became a pure fiat currency backed only by confidence in the U.S. government. For a time, the system held together. The petrodollar arrangement of the 1970 seconds, which required oil to be traded globally in U.S. dollars, created strong artificial demand for the currency. But behind the facade of stability, America's debt began to spiral. In 1980, the U.S. national debt was about $900 billion. By 2000, it had risen to $5.6 trillion. By 2020, it had exploded to $27 trillion. And by 2025, it has surpassed $36 trillion, a 40-fold increase in just 45 years. The 21st century saw a new chapter in monetary excess. After the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve launched quantitative easing QE, creating trillions of dollars electronically to buy government bonds and mortgage securities. Between 2008 and 2020, the Fed's balance sheet ballooned from under $1 trillion to more than $7 trillion. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the government printed another $4 trillion in just 2 years to fund stimulus checks, business bailouts, and social programs, more money than had been created in the previous century combined. Predictably, inflation surged. In 2022, consumer inflation officially reached 9%, the highest in 4 decades. Everyday Americans felt it in food, housing, and energy costs. Meanwhile, the dollar's global dominance began to erode. In 2000, roughly 70% of the world's foreign reserves were held in dollars. By 2025, that share has fallen to around 58%, and it continues to decline. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are now developing new trade systems that bypass the dollar entirely. Central banks around the world are buying gold at record levels, hedging against the decline of the U.S. currency. Yet Washington continues the same path as the empires before it. The federal government runs trillion-dollar deficits even in peacetime borrowing, endlessly to fund military welfare and bureaucratic expansion. The U.S. maintains nearly 800 military bases in over 70 countries and spends more than $800 billion annually on defense, more than the next 10 nations combined. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan alone cost over $8 trillion, funded entirely by debt. Rome debased its coins to pay its legions. Spain flooded Europe with silver until inflation destroyed its wealth. Britain abandoned gold and lost its empire within a generation. Today, America prints digital dollars by the trillions to sustain an economy, military, and government it can no longer afford. Inflation is rising, confidence is falling, and global alternatives to the dollar are multiplying. The warning signs are identical. The empire is vast, the spending endless, and as always, the empire is expensive and it's being funded with debt and printed money. So let's identify the pattern, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every major empire throughout history has followed the same 7-stage cycle of economic rise and collapse. The sequence is identical each time: dominance, overextension, deficits, debasement, inflation, loss of confidence, and finally collapse. Stage 1, dominance. The empire reaches its height of power. Its military, economy, and currency dominate the world. Rome had the silver denarius, Spain had the silver real, Britain had the gold-backed pound sterling, and the United States has the dollar backed by gold since 1944 under the Bretton Woods Agreement. Each empire began with financial integrity, a currency trusted across borders because it was tied to something real. Stage 2, overextension. With dominance comes ambition and expansion. Rome built armies across 3 continents. Spain conquered and ruled territories on every ocean. Britain colonized a quarter of the earth. Today, America maintains nearly 800 military bases in over 70 countries and spends more than $800 billion a year on defense, more than the next 10 nations combined. The costs of maintaining global dominance grow faster than the revenues that support it. Stage 3, permanent deficits. When expenses exceed income, borrowing becomes standard. Rome drained its treasury to fund endless campaigns. Spain borrowed to pay for wars and imported luxuries. Britain issued mountains of bonds to finance 2 world wars. The United States now runs trillion-dollar deficits every year, even in peacetime. Federal debt has risen from $900 billion in 1980 to $36 trillion in 2025, exceeding the size of its entire economy. Stage 4, currency debasement or money printing. When borrowing and taxes can't cover the gap, governments debase the currency. Rome cut silver in its coins from 100% to 5%. Spain flooded Europe with New World silver, causing inflation. Britain left gold in 1931 and devalued the pound twice after the war. The U.S. closed the gold window in 1971, and since then, the Federal Reserve has printed trillions, especially after 2008 and COVID-19, when $4 trillion was created in just 2 years. Stage 5, inflation. Too much money leads to rising prices. In Rome, prices rose 50-fold. In Spain, a century of inflation hollowed out its wealth. Britain saw 25% inflation in the 1,970 seconds. In America, inflation hit 9% in 2022, with housing, food, and energy costs climbing far faster than wages. Stage 6, loss of confidence. When people and nations lose faith in the currency, collapse begins. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen from 70% in 2000 to 58% in 2025, while BRICS nations trade in local currencies and central banks buy record amounts of gold. Stage 7, collapse. Once confidence is gone, the currency and the empire falls. Rome in 476 AD, Spain by the 1600s, Britain by the 1970 seconds. The U.S. now stands in stage 5, moving quickly toward stage 6, the same point every empire reaches before the fall. History gives us 3 possible outcomes when an empire reaches the final stages of its economic cycle. The first is a controlled decline, the path Britain followed after World War II. By 1945, British national debt had reached 270% of GDP, and its currency was devalued by 30% in 1949 and again by 14% in 1967. Yet, through political stability and gradual adaptation, Britain managed to transition from a global empire to a secondary power without complete collapse. The second possibility is a chaotic breakdown like the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. Rome's currency, once pure silver, had fallen to just 5% silver content. Soldiers went unpaid, trade collapsed, and the empire fragmented into centuries of disorder. The third potential outcome is a reset or restructuring a new monetary order that replaces the old system. This could mean a return to a gold-backed standard, the rise of China's yuan, or a BRICS currency as a global reserve, or even a digitally managed basket of currencies backed by commodities or blockchain technology. Each scenario carries pain and disruption, but the difference lies in whether the decline is managed through reform or allowed to spiral into systemic chaos. And here's what makes this different from Rome, Spain, or Britain the U.S. The dollar isn't just a national currency, it's the world's reserve currency, used in over 80% of global trade and held in 58% of central bank reserves. When it collapses, the entire interconnected global economy amplifies both the impact and the chaos. But the pattern says it's coming not as a theory, but as a mathematical inevitability. Every empire that ignored fiscal reality has ended the same way. Rome debased its silver denarius from 100% purity to just 5%, destroying its currency and collapsing its economy. Spain, once rich beyond imagination from New World, silver defaulted 4 times between 1557 and 1596, losing both its credit and its empire. Britain, after financing 2 world wars, saw its national debt soar to 270% of GDP by 1945, forcing 2 humiliating devaluations, 30% in 1949 and 14% in 1967, and surrendering global reserve status to the dollar at Bretton Woods in 1944. And now the United States, with federal debt exceeding $36 trillion and over $4 trillion printed in just 2 years during COVID stimulus, is repeating the same script. The sequence never changes. Excessive spending leads to debt. Debt leads to money printing. Printing triggers inflation. Inflation destroys confidence. And the loss of confidence collapses the system. The laws of economics are as absolute as the laws of physics. They do not care about ideology, politics, or military power. Empires fall not because they are conquered, but because they consume themselves from within. The warning signs are already visible: inflation deficits and fading trust in the dollar. History has seen this exact movie 4 times before. The ending is inevitable. The only variables left are how fast it happens and how painful it will be. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe, because when the pattern completes, you'll want to understand what happened and why. 2059, history has the answers, and the pattern never lies.
Thank you.